I don't think I've ever heard a single soul say that Pagani isn't one of the most prestigious performance brands out there, since they've made so many great cars, and this is one of them right here. The Pagani Zonda Cinque is one of the most exclusive cars ever made, with 5 only being produced. It has an absolutely massive 7.3-liter V12 engine that makes 671 horsepower, and it has a top speed of 217 miles an hour with a 0 to 60 time of 2.8 seconds. So how do those specs translate into overall usability in the exotic tier? The first thing you'll see whenever you try to select the Zonda Cinque in the tier is that there's 4 versions of it, and I will be talking about each version in this video. For the sake of the base review, I'm just going to be talking about the regular Zonda Cinque, with regular being a very umbrella term because this car is anything but regular. Immediately noticeable is that this is one of the lightest cars in the tier just behind the Sesto Elemento, and I think this really translates into its performance. Acceleration is the first thing I'll talk about, and this shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone, but it's very good. It has a 0 to 60 time, like I mentioned earlier, of 2.8 seconds, and this translates really well into the game. Its lightweight makes it very capable, and even though I won't say it's better than the Sesto Elemento, it is still a very capable car overall for acceleration. And I'm realizing it now while I'm making this video, but I made a mistake whenever I made my Murcielago SV video. I said that the SV was very comparable to the Zonda in terms of acceleration, and this was because the Murcielago has all-wheel drive. But even though I do think it's still very capable, I actually think the Zonda is a bit better because of that lighter weight. I think another reason why I thought the Murcielago could be just as capable with acceleration is that the SV has much better nitro strengths than the Zonda. And that's the next thing I'll talk about with the Zonda, which I think is a bigger downside. For whatever reason, the Zonda's nitros aren't as powerful as some of the other cars in the tier. And besides the Veyron, I think this car was actually the first that made me realize that each car in this game have different strengths for nitrous, and this car I think is definitely on the lesser end. Even though I think the Zonda's acceleration is capable enough without nitrous, it is something to be noted and something that is actually very unfortunate for what is otherwise a great car. Thankfully though, that's the only real performance disadvantage that the Zonda has, and the review will mostly be uphill from here. As I mentioned before, the Zonda has a top speed of 217 miles an hour, which is actually on the higher end in the exotic tier, and with the turbo, it still continues to be just as capable. I've maxed out around 232 miles an hour, which is on the higher end, but it's still not as fast as the Murcielago SV. One car that I'll also bring up that I think is also really important to mention is the Viper. Now, it's actually just as capable as the Zonda in terms of top speed, but the Zonda is notably lighter than the Viper, and that translates into its handling as well. Now, I don't think the Zonda is as good as the Viper in terms of handling, but the Zonda is mid-engined and it makes it feel a lot more precise. Now with that being said, the majority of the exotic tier is mid-engined, but with the Zonda being so much lighter than those, it really feels like you can put the car wherever you need to, and this is especially important whenever time trials and races pretty much require that you be as precise as possible. And because of all those attributes that I mentioned earlier, the Zonda is actually in contention for being the best car in the tier for handling. I will once again mention that the Viper is also very good with its handling, but the Zonda feels so much more responsive, and this is especially important for really quick reaction situations like with oncoming traffic. So its nitrous capabilities aside, and it seems like the Zonda is a great overall package, with one exception, and that being pursuits. Now, I don't want to say that the Zonda is bad when it comes to pursuits, but the Zonda is so easily targeted because of that light weight, and I would even say that weapons do additional damage to the Zonda, which is pretty much unheard of in the tier otherwise. If you use the Zonda in a pursuit and become too careless, you can find yourself at half or less HP so quickly, and this is especially a downside whenever you just started the event and you find yourself being targeted by every Interceptor available. And coming from personal experience, this happens a lot more often than you think it does, and this is especially showcased in its featured events. The Zonda faces off against the cops in a time trial, and the cops that are in the event are much heavier than the Zonda, and they are much quicker when it comes to acceleration, and they can easily catch up to the Zonda, and especially like I said, with its nitrous capabilities not as strong as the Interceptors. You don't have any offensive weapons to help you in the pursuit either, which I think is a really big downside for this event. And even though the Zonda does have jammers to help you out with the cop spikes, it doesn't really help with direct onslaughts, which will happen if you're not fast enough to outrun the cops. Overall though, I actually really do like this event. It showcases the Zonda's capabilities perfectly, where speed and precision means everything, while also avoiding the cops' direct attacks and maintaining your health to showcase that the Zonda is in fact a very frail car. Now I want to talk about one of the Zonda's variants. It has the only Need for Speed Edition variant in the entire game, and honestly, this is a really interesting idea. The first thing you'll most likely notice about the NFS Edition Zonda is the paint, and how there are only two options available for it unless you go for custom painting. But other than that, the specs on paper are exactly identical. 671 horsepower and a 0 to 62 listed on screen of 3.2 seconds. And even though they're exactly the same on paper, I can't help but think that the NFS Edition accelerates just a little bit quicker. I know it might be silly to assume that, but it's just a gut feeling that I have. Other than that hunch of what I think might be faster acceleration, but it might just be the event I used the NFS Edition for, I couldn't quite find any distinguishable differences in performance. So what I think I want to do is talk about why I think this was added to the game. And this is really interesting because NFS editions weren't really prevalent until Need for Speed The Run, which was introduced a year later than this game. Turns out, I'm actually wrong about this. I actually forgot until as I finished editing this video that they were introducing Need for Speed Hot Pursuit 2 back on the PlayStation 2. And if the internet is correct, there are a total of 15 NFS edition cars. Maybe this was a nod to those NFS editions in the Hot Pursuit 2, but still pretty interesting how Hot Pursuit 2 had 15, while this one only has the single one in the Zonda. NFS editions were meant to be higher tier performance cars than their regular counterparts. So if that was really meant to be the case, why was this added in the exact same tier with the exact same stats? It really makes you wonder on what EA was thinking whenever they made this car. And I'm not saying it shouldn't have been added, but if they were to add NFS editions to the game, why not add more? Because it's a really interesting concept, but the way this was done in practice was not ideal. And it makes you wonder even more why the Zonda was the only car in the game that got an NFS edition. And I can't really help but think that they meant to add this as a higher tier counterpart with better specs. In fact, I know this was intentionally added because the Zonda Cinque NFS edition is the cover car alongside the Reventon, and I'll display a picture on screen now. But if the Zonda Cinque got an NFS edition, why didn't the Reventon get one? Maybe I'm thinking a bit too much about this for it not being that much of an important feature, but I think this is one of the biggest missed potentials of this game, and especially so in the remastered version, because we lost a couple of really good cars compared to the base version. One of my personal favorites, the SLR McLaren and the Sterling Moss edition, both got removed because of licensing issues. And even in the Highway Patrol unit, we lost the Carbon Motors E7, which was a really interesting police concept car. Now of course, to make up for it in the remastered version, we got every DLC for free. So we got the Super Sports DLC pack, the Lamborghini and the Porsche packs, and the SCPD Rebels pack. But we didn't get any new cars. And I feel like adding NFS editions to certain cars would have easily mitigated for this issue, and putting them in higher tiers with better stats would be really interesting. Now, I'm not saying that just adding NFS editions to more cars would make up completely for essentially having less cars. In fact, they should have added more cars in general for the remaster. But again, with the licensing issues that they had with the aforementioned SLR, the Sterling Moss, and the Carbon Motors E7, I didn't really expect them to add new cars to the game. This entire tangent could honestly make its own video. So, for the sake of the video length and for you guys' own sanity, I'm probably just going to leave a timestamp somewhere in here and just leave this thought process here for now. Our next Zonda variant that we're going to move on to is the Cinque Roadster, which actually has a very distinguishable difference compared to the Coupe. For whatever reason, the Roadster shifts a little bit faster than the Coupe, and for that reason, it actually accelerates just a little bit faster. Other than that though, the specs are once again identical. so it has the same 671 horsepower that the Coupe and the NFS Edition have. But the faster shifting aside, and it performs exactly the same. But it does have a featured event where it takes on another time trial but without the cops. And this is a very, very straightforward event. I don't think that this is really the best introduction to the Zonda. Even though it does show that the Zonda is very strong for acceleration and it does have very good top speed, it doesn't really showcase its handling capabilities much. Like I said, this is a very, very straightforward event, quite literally. And you don't really get a chance to use the Zonda again until after you actually unlock it. I'll touch on that real quick because I didn't really get into it whenever I talked about the Coupe version, but the Coupe is unlocked about halfway through the tier, which isn't bad. But the Roadster is unlocked so much later than it, and I never really understood why. Because, like I said, they're the exact same car, and in the base Hot Pursuit, they were unlocked right next to each other. Even though the Roadster is unlocked much later than the Coupe, I won't dock points from the Cinque itself just because it's still an overall usable car, but it is something to be noted if you wanted to use the Roadster instead. The last racer variant of the Zonda is the Roadster NFS Edition, and I'll try to move past this quickly because, like I mentioned before, I don't really think there's any distinguishable differences in performance. It once again has identical specs to the base Zonda, 671 horsepower, 0 to 62 of 3.2 seconds. And if my hunch is right about these NFS cars, the Roadster NFS Edition is seemingly the best car to use in practice, because it has the faster shifting that the Cinque Roadster offers, and it would have that faster acceleration compared to the base Cinque. So, other than that, it's once again exactly the same. The Zonda Roadster and the NFS edition of the Roadster can both be selected in a Hot Pursuit, but not as an exclusive car per se. They once again face off against the cops, but in a Hot Pursuit, against some other convertibles. It once again showcases that the Zonda is a very frail car and needs to be driven as efficiently as possible to minimize damage. But unlike the gauntlet that the base Zonda had, you don't have any weapons to assist you at all. So no turbos, no jammers, no EMPs, no spikes. But the cops do have some weapons to stop you. For one, they have roadblocks, which in and of itself can be a massive issue, especially if you ram them head on and they take a massive chunk of your health otherwise. The big killer is by the end of the event, where the cops send out a helicopter, which won't really do much to you if you're quick, but if you took a lot of damage by that point, if you hit a spike strip, that could end your run right then and there. This is another great event that showcases the Zonda's capabilities, but only if you really know what you're doing. So overall, the Zonda is a fantastic car between its lightweight and its great handling. The Zonda Interceptor thankfully continues to hold its reputation as a great handling car as well. The first thing I'll briefly mention before I talk about the performance is the looks. I think that this is hands down the best looking Interceptor in the Speed Enforcement unit. Even though you do notice the light bars on the Zonda Interceptor, they aren't nearly as bulky, and they're actually implemented into the lines of the car, which I think just looks so much better. That and the gold painting just, I think, really sets this car apart. Alright, enough fanboying about how this car looks, because even though it does look amazing, we're just now getting to the Interceptor version and we're almost 14 minutes into the video. So with that being said, let's talk about performance. The Zonda Interceptor once again finds itself being very capable for handling, and this hasn't changed one bit thankfully, because I think this would have been really disappointing to hear otherwise. It doesn't have any direct events featuring it, and for that reason, it often finds itself to be a bit overlooked. Rapid responses is the first real thing I'll talk about with the Zonda Interceptor, and this shouldn't really come as a surprise because its lightweight makes it so capable as a racer, but it's honestly, I think, one of the best cars in the tier for it in general. Because of that lightweight and its really fast acceleration, and thankfully its nitro is actually getting a much bigger boost compared to its racer counterpart, it's in contention for being one of the best cars in the tier for rapid responses. I think it does have some worthy rivals in the Speed Enforcement unit for rapid responses. Once again, the Sesto Elemento finds itself to be one of the better cars overall for rapid responses. But I think the McLaren MP412C also has a say in this, just because it is also mid-engined and very lightweight. But I think the Zonda feels a bit more precise than those cars, and especially so the Sesto Elemento. Unfortunately though, it doesn't quite find as many niche advantages for Hot Pursuits and Interceptors. Like I've mentioned several times over, but its lightweight makes it very frail, and because of that, it doesn't really deal as much damage to suspects. Now, it's not unusable for those events at all, but I think you are a bit better off using something like the Bentley or maybe even the Viper for those hot pursuits and interceptors. It's worth mentioning though that I think the statement holds its value a bit more for hot pursuits rather than interceptors, because at least with interceptors, you're only targeting one suspect and it's very easy to keep track of them. But with hot pursuits, you're targeting 5, 6, 7 racers at a time. And if they all come at you at once, the Zonda finds itself to be at a very distinct disadvantage because of, once again, that light weight, and it'll often find itself to be a bit overwhelmed, especially if you're not using weapons. Even though it's not directly related to hot pursuits and interceptors, I kinda wish the Zonda Interceptor had the gearbox from the Roadster version, because even though I do think it's very capable on its own, I think the faster shifting capabilities that the Roadster offers would translate really well into the Interceptor's overall usability. So overall, even though the Zonda Interceptor is very capable with rapid responses, with those aforementioned hot pursuits and interceptors not being its strong suit, it doesn't find itself being useful in all situations. And for being an interceptor, it kinda needs to be effective for every situation to be a truly useful car. But that's not to say that it's useless, because I think this is actually a very understated car in the speed enforcement unit. And it's kind of wrong to disregard what it's capable of just because it's not good at a few kinds of events. But the Pagani Zonda Cinque as a car in general is one of my favorites of all time. I think it's one of the best looking cars Pagani's ever produced, even better than the Huayra, and even though the Zonda R isn't in this game, this is the closest you can really get to it. And if you're looking for a really solid and general usage car in the exotic and speed enforcement tier, you really can't go wrong with the Zonda. And I think it's one of the best sounding cars in this game in general as well. And even though that won't translate into its score, I do think it deserves a 9 out of 10 for overall usability.